participate in such a stimulating conference. I do confess that this topic is somewhat outside my areas of expertise, but when Altai told me about the idea for this conference 2 years ago and asked if there was anything from Ethiopia that I could contribute, I knew right away that I had to absolutely say something about the Solomonic dynasty and the Kəbra Nagaśt, an epic text typically referred to in English as the Glory of Kings. And I happen to have here Stefan Strelczyn's lovely but fragmentary Polish translation of Augustine Legenda Narodowa, and I do not at all recommend the English translation of Bunch, unfortunately. So, among those who are neither Ethiopian or Eritrean, or engaged in Ethiopian studies, there are generally two things which people, whether or not they are academics, associate with respect to Ethiopia's history and literature. And the first is, of course, biblical literature, especially Apocrypha, since it is among Ethiopic manuscripts that we find many invaluable witnesses to books such as 1 Enoch, Jubilees, the Testament of the Lord, and many others. The second is Ethiopia's long-standing claim to possess the Ark of the Covenant, in spite of what Indiana Jones might have us believe. The legend surrounding the Ark's arrival in Ethiopia, which forms a significant part of the Glory of Kings, is so widespread that it was even featured in a 2013 episode of the popular American TV series Ancient Aliens. But more than just a legend concerning the Ark, the Glory of Kings is, for Ethiopians even today, a foundational national epic, much like Virgil's Aeneid among the Romans. Of interest for us today, though, is the text's central role in the legitimization of the Solomonic dynasty, an imperial dynasty formed at the end of the 13th century and which lasted more or less until 1974. But first, let us start with some helpful geographic and historical context. So shown here is a map of modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, highlighting the approximate boundaries of the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia in the Middle Ages. Our focus today will largely be on four key regions. The first is Tigray in northern Ethiopia, which was the heart of the Aksumite kingdom that dominated the region during late antiquity. Tigray is also home to the oldest monasteries in Ethiopia, established over the 2 centuries following Aksum's Christianization in the middle of the 4th century. The second is Lasta, which was the seat of power of the Zagwe dynasty, which ruled Ethiopia during the High Middle Ages. Unlike their Aksumite predecessors, the Zagwe belonged to a clan of Cushitic origin, who nevertheless continued to use the Semitic Ge'ez language as a liturgical and written language, similar to the persistence of Latin in medieval Europe. And lastly, we have the regions of Amhara and Shoa, the homeland of the so-called Solomonic kings who overthrew the Zagwe dynasty towards the end of the 13th century. They too continued to use Ge'ez alongside vernacular Amharic, which is essentially the lingua franca of modern-day Ethiopia. Under the Solomonic kings, a preeminent position was given first to the monastery of Debre Estipanos in Amhara, led by Jesus Moa, and later to the monastery of Debre Libanos in Shoa, founded by the famous Ethiopian saint Tekle Haimanot. And now for the dramatis personae. It is generally agreed that the last effective Zagwe king was Yetbarek, son of the famous Saint King Lalibela, who died fighting against Yəkunno ďAmlāk in 1268. After his death, the remaining Zagwe officials retreated north to Tigray, where it seems they appointed a certain Prince Delanda as king, while they attempted unsuccessfully to resist Yəkunno ďAmlāk's invasion. Referred to in contemporary sources as the King of Amhara, little is known, at least with any degree of certainty, regarding Yəkunno ďAmlāk's origins, aside from his obvious high standing among the Amhara elite. According to some traditions, he had previously been a supporter of Ne'akwato La'ab, Yetbarek's cousin and predecessor, later to be imprisoned under Yetbarek. After escaping from his imprisonment, he launches his revolt, drawing upon his strong base of support in Amhara and in northern Shoa. After his death, he was succeeded by several of his sons and grandsons, whose reigns were largely uneventful and mostly relatively short. This changed upon the accession of his grandson, Amidst, whose long reign saw significant territorial expansion and widespread efforts to solidify his position as king of Ethiopia and to forge a strong claim for the dynasty founded by his grandfather. But how did Yəkunno ďAmlāk actually succeed in overthrowing the Zagwe dynasty? As was already mentioned, various sources agree that it was the combined forces of his own armies in Amhara and his allies in Shoa that managed to drive the Zagwe out of Lasta before finally putting down their remaining supporters in Tigray. Such a military rebellion, however, is not nearly enough to establish a new royal dynasty. And it so happens that the time of Yəkunno ʻAmlāk's rise to power coincided with increased evangelization in Shoa and neighboring regions. These efforts were led by charismatic and influential Amharic monks who, establishing many new monasteries and strengthening existing ones, came to dominate the Ethiopian church. Some might say that Yəkunno ʻAmlāk's most important supporter in the long term was not any military general, but rather a simple yet ambitious monk, namely Yēzus Moa, the abbot of Debre Haik Estefanos. As reported in the Gedla Yēzus Moa, or the Life of Yēzus Moa, a 17th century compilation of oral and written accounts, some dating as early as the 15th century, Yəkunno ʻAmlāk was imprisoned upon a mountain by King Yetbata. Making a rope out of monkey hair, he escapes, and having heard of the monk's pious fasting and prayer, goes to him and, quote, commends himself to his prayer. Having earlier established by means of a fictitious genealogy that the father of Yəkunno ʻAmlāk, named Tesfa Yesus, was a descendant of the earlier Aksumite kings who reigned prior to the Zagwe, the life of Yēzus Moa continues, quote, and Yəkunno ʻAmlāk said to him, if the Lord returns to me the kingdom of my father through your prayer, I will do for you whatever is in your heart and that which your soul desires. Yēzus Moa replies, quote, if the Lord returns to you the kingdom of your father by my prayer, swear to me that you will separate the women and the widows and remove them from this island and make this island a place for monks, to which Yəkunno ʻAmlāk agrees. Later in the life, are enumerated 5 pacts made between Yəkunno ʻAmlāk and Yēzus Moa. Firstly, that the monks of Debre Haik Estefanos are permitted to sit while a decree from the king is being read. Secondly, that no king, prince, or governor may divest the monastery of the land given to it. Thirdly, that anyone fleeing to the island is granted asylum and released from the death penalty. Fourthly, that no one can claim to have inherited property by right of birth on the monastery's island. And fifthly, that no one may inherit anything on the island unless he becomes a monk. In this way, Yəkunno ʻAmlāk's accession, here depicted as a righteous restoration, is made to be inextricably linked with the privileged position of the monastery of Debre Haik Estefanos and the legacy of its founder, Yēzus Moa. It is important to note that Yəkunno ʻAmlāk's donations to the monastery are in fact confirmed by contemporary records kept in the monastery's Golden Gospel manuscript. Another hagiography of a prominent monk contemporary to Yəkunno ʻAmlāk, the Gedla Koistos, or the Life of Koistos, supposedly a 14th century composition, also establishes an important link between the king and the monastic leaders of his time. The text claims that the mother of Saint Koistos, namely, who's named Amidst, was also the mother of Yəkunno ʻAmlāk, although from a different father. On 2 separate occasions, an icon of the Virgin Mary miraculously speaks to Amidst and tells of her children's futures. The first time, the text says, quote, the icon of Our Lady Mary spoke like a person to Amidst, saying, first you will bear a son, and this son will not be yours, but rather a soldier of the heavenly king. Then you will give birth from another man, an Israelite, and he will become king of all Ethiopia. When you give birth to him, name him Yəkunno ʻAmlāk, end quote. The first son evidently is Koistos, who later was given to relatives to be raised according to a religious lifestyle. As for the other son, Yəkunno ʻAmlāk, it is important to note that the text calls his father an Israelite. Though he is obviously Ethiopian, the intention is to emphasize Yəkunno ʻAmlāk's legendary descent from the biblical King Solomon, as described in the epic Glory of the Kings, which I introduced briefly and will return to shortly. The second time, the icon reiterates to Amidst that she will not raise Koistos herself, but should look forward to her future children. The icon says, quote, but there are 4 children in your womb who will be born later, 2 from your current husband Galaudios, and later 2 children from another man, an Israelite. Your son will become king of all Ethiopia, and he will judge the entire world according to the counsel of these elected children, ruling according to the law of the Lord's commandments, which are established in the book of the law and the Gospels. End quote. As in the first appearance, the icon of the Virgin Mary foretells that Amidst will give birth to a son by an Israelite, who will become a king of Ethiopia. In addition, it notes that he will have the counsel of the elect children, presumably a reference to Koistos and the other boys who grew up with him, later to become important monastic leaders in Ethiopia. Later, Oestos, after being raised alongside the future Saint ﷺ, is reunited with his father, a governor named Galaudios, and they go on pilgrimage to Egypt and Jerusalem. Praying in the church of St. Claudius, his namesake, Galaudios is visited by the saint, accompanied by other martyrs, including Victor, George, and Syracuse. The martyrs tell him, quote, "Your son was chosen by Our Lady Mary, the Mother of God, to become a new apostle to the whole of Ethiopia, that it might be blessed during the reign of his appointment, for your land is her inheritance, which our Lord Jesus Christ gave to her. And because of this, we will go with you, and you will build churches in our name during the reign of your son's brother, who will be born of his mother and another man, an Israelite." End quote. And thus, the life of Oestos makes out Yəkunno ʻAmlāk to be a divinely appointed king of Israelite origin, whose reign will be just and pious. With regards to the claim of familial ties between Oestos and Yəkunno ʻAmlāk, the life further establishes ties between the king and several other monastic leaders of the time, including Zena Marcos and ʻTeklahaimenot. The connection with ʻTeklahaimenot is especially important, as he would go on to become the most widely venerated indigenous saint of Ethiopia, and the monastery he founded, Debra Libanos, would eventually surpass Jesus Moa's own monastery of Debra Sifanos, both in ecclesiastical and political significance. In fact, the life of Oestos claims that it was by the hand of ʻTeklahaimenot that Yəkunno ʻAmlāk was anointed as king, discarding completely any role played by Jesus Moa. It has long been established by numerous studies that the various hagiographies of the saints of this period, not only the lives of Oestos and Jesus Moa, but also ʻTeklahaimenot and others, were revised in favor of Debra Libanos, so that Jesus Moa was no longer ʻTeklahaimenot's superior, and that it was ʻTeklahaimenot and not Jesus Moa who made a pact with Yəkunno ʻAmlāk and aided him in becoming king. While on the one hand, this shows how the monasteries were keen to elevate the prestige of their respective founders by association with Yəkunno ʻAmlāk, it is equally possible to say that Yəkunno ʻAmlāk's legitimacy as king and his legacy as a whole was greatly reinforced by these hagiographies. Lastly, on the topic of hagiographies, there is one dedicated to Yəkunno ʻAmlāk himself, the Gedla Yəkunno ʻAmlāk, attested only in a single manuscript kept in the Church of Bineta Mariam in Lasta. While unpublished and essentially unstudied, it has been suggested that the text is a lay compilation, perhaps even from the 20th century, collecting stories from other texts, especially the lives of Jesus Moa and ʻTeklahaimenot. As to why the text was put together in the first place, especially in Lasta, the former seat of the Zagreb, we may suppose that it is due to the fact that the Church of Bineta Mariam was founded by Yəkunno ʻAmlāk himself. Preserved in the church is the only contemporary painting of Yəkunno ʻAmlāk, depicting him along two clerics, Mehari ʻAmlāk and Neheyo Christos, along with a dedicatory inscription reading, quote, "With thanksgiving to God, I had this church built, I, King Yəkunno ʻAmlāk, whom the Lord made king according to his will. Neheyo Christos, my spiritual father, was a steward for me and had this church built in the name of Saint Mata. May the Lord have mercy upon me in the kingdom of heaven, belong to my fathers Mehari ʻAmlāk and Neheyo Christos. Amen." It has been suggested that the church's construction and prominent dedicatory painting was a symbol of the king's power in the former domain of his now defeated rivals. I think it goes without saying that the hagiographic texts do not withstand scrutiny with respect to their several and conflicting narratives. But when we consider additional evidence, such as this church painting and contemporary documents regarding land grants and donations, there is no doubt that Yəkunno ʻAmlāk endeavored to develop close connections with the influential monastic leaders of his time, connections which proved mutually beneficial to the ambitions of both. However apocryphal they may be, the embellished narratives put forward by these hagiographies solidify this legacy of close cooperation, while reinforcing the claim that Yəkunno ʻAmlāk was not a rebel or a conqueror, but a restorer ordained by God. It is important also to note that the positive description of Yəkunno ʻAmlāk in these hagiographies stands in sharp contrast to the depiction of his grandson, Amidst, who repeatedly came into conflict with the exact same monks and frequently subjected them to punishments in exile. So now to come back to the Glory of Kings. The Glory of Kings has for centuries been the subject of great scholarly interest and heated debate. The text's origins, transmission, and revision are hardly agreed upon by scholars. For our purposes today, though, we need not concern ourselves too much with these debates, and will try to stay within the bounds of what is generally agreed upon, what is most likely, and what the evidence itself gives us. The text is rather layered and composite, more like a compilation than a single narrative or treatise, which makes it quite difficult to follow or to summarize, but I try to do my best. The Glory of Kings opens by calling itself, quote, an exposition and explanation of the 318 Orthodox, this being the bishops of the Council of Nicaea, concerning glory, greatness, and dignity, and how the Lord gave these to the children of Adam, and especially concerning the greatness and glory of Zion, the ark of the law of the Lord. After several more opening lines, it arrives at its true commencement, the beginning of the second chapter, quote, let us begin to discuss which among the kings of the earth, from the first to the last, we will magnify or reduce in glory and greatness. Gregory, and this means Gregory the Illuminator, the first bishop of Armenia, who was kept in a cave in tribulation on account of the love of the witness of Christ for 15 years, stood and said, while I was in the cave, I thought about this matter, and about the foolishness of the king of Armenia, and I said, to the extent of my mind, what is the greatness of kings? After this follows an excursus by Gregory on the kingship of Adam, Noah, and Abraham and their descendants, with some interruptions regarding the glory of the Ark of the Covenant and notes of agreement from the other bishops in Nicaea. Coming to the 19th chapter, a certain Domitius, sorry for the formatting, a certain Domitius, a fictitious patriarch of Constantinople, joins the discussion. He tells the assembly how he found, quote, a book in the Church of Sophia, which is an obvious anachronism, which states that the kingdom of the whole world belongs to the king of Rome and to the king of Ethiopia. It is this book, apparently quoted in its entirety by Domitius in the middle of the assembly, which forms the 74 chapters which follow, and which contains the epic story of the Queen of Sheba, the King Solomon, and their son Menelik, the first king of Ethiopia. The book tells how the Queen of the South, meaning the Queen of Sheba, who here is named Makeda, was attracted to the story of Solomon's wisdom. Traveling to Jerusalem in order to meet him, she is deceived by the king, who coerces her into sleeping with him. Departing, Makeda later gives birth to a son, Solomon's first son, whom she names ģenelechem, but in later traditions, and more commonly in modern literature, this name is rendered as Menelik, though the name itself is ultimately derived from Arabic, Ibn al-Hakim, the son of the wise one. Menelik grows up and, desiring to meet his father, travels to Jerusalem in order to meet Solomon. Lavishing gifts upon his son, the king appoints Menelik as his heir. Upon hearing Menelik's intention to return to Ethiopia, Solomon plots to have his own son, Rehoboam, become his successor in Israel, while giving another of his sons in marriage to the daughter of Balthazar, the king of Rome, and thus bring under his control all three kingdoms. The high priest Zadok anoints Menelik as king of Ethiopia in the temple, and Solomon sends with him the eldest sons of the noblemen and priests of Israel, that they might establish Ethiopia as a Jewish kingdom. The sons, however, conspire to take the Ark of the Covenant with them to Ethiopia, and succeed unbeknownst to Solomon and Zadok. Arriving in Ethiopia, Queen Makeda hands over her kingdom to her son, and makes all the nobles of Ethiopia take an oath that, quote, they will not make women rule upon the throne of the kingdom of Ethiopia, and only the male seed of Menelik, son of Solomon. Reaching the end of Domitius' book, the bishops in Nicaea remark at how it agrees with Gregory's words regarding kingship. Gregory then expounds upon various passages in the Old Testament, giving Christian interpretations, and then gives prophecies concerning the kingdoms of Rome and Ethiopia. He first prophesies that Rome will fall into apostasy under King Marcian, then later that Jews will rise up in Armenia against the Romans and in Nadran against the Ethiopians. As a result, the Roman King Justin and the Ethiopian King Caleb will meet in Jerusalem and go to war together against the Jews. These prophecies do in fact bear some element of truth, of course, since they were written centuries after the event they're supposed to predict. The Eastern Roman Emperor Marcian convened the Council of Chalcedon in 451, which ruled in favor of a Diaphysite Christology, despite strong opposition from the Coptic and Ethiopian churches, as well as also Syria. And the resulting schism saw these churches separate and anathematize their Byzantine and Roman counterparts. The Eastern Roman Emperor Justin I, meanwhile, did in fact coordinate with the Aksumite king Caleb to invade Himyar in response to the massacring of Christians in Najran. Finally, we come to the colophon of the text, which notes that it was translated from Coptic into Arabic in Ethiopia in the year 1225 during the reign of the Zagwe king Lalibela. Whether or not there truly was a Coptic original, or even an Arabic version, is fiercely debated by scholars. As to why it was not immediately translated into Ge'ez, the language of the Ethiopians, here referred to by the Arabizing phrase Negar Habasi, the scribe named Yeshak explains, quote, "The Zagwe did not translate the book because it says, 'Those who reign but are not of Israel transgress the law.'" While Yeshak claims that he undertook the work for the glory of Ethiopia and its king, he did not do it under the king's authority. Rather, he says he did it under the authority of Ya'ebike, a Tigrayan governor who unsuccessfully rebelled against King Amidst, the grandson of Yəkunno ʻAmlāk, and whose reign dominated the first half of the 14th century. This has led many scholars to suggest that the original aim of the Glory of Kings was to elevate the nobility of Tigray, the supposed descendants of Menelik and the noble Israelites who settled in Ethiopia, above the new dynasty of kings who came from Amhara and Showa in the south. Regardless, the legend ultimately came to be used as a propagandistic and legitimizing tool by the Solomonic kings. As was already seen, medieval hagiographies refer to the kings both as Israelites and as restorers of the earlier kingdom of the Aksumites, the alleged descendants of Menelik. During the time of King Johannes I, who reigned during the second half of the 17th century, a sort of sequel to the Glory of Kings was produced, a short treatise titled The Wealth of the Kings, While the Glory of Kings describes how the Solomonic dynasty of Ethiopia was founded, the Wealth of the Kings describes how it was restored. Borrowing entirely from the lives of Yəkunno and ʻAmlāk, the work tells how God, being displeased with the house of David, gave the kingdom of Ethiopia to the Zagwe. Again, discarding Yəkunno in favor of ʻAmlāk, the text repeats a legend found in the life whereby the last Zagwe king, Yetbarek, hears a rooster crowing and proclaiming each day, "He who eats my head shall reign and inherit the kingdom of David." Following the advice of ʻAmlāk, he orders a servant to cook it in secret so that he might eat it and ensure that his reign continues. Unfortunately for him, a servant discards the head out of habit, and it is Yəkunno ʻAmlāk who finds it and eats it by accident. As the text notes, quote, Yəkunno ʻAmlāk was chosen from his mother's womb to inherit the throne of David, his father. For the Lord remembered his oath which he swore to David, saying, "I will establish your throne unto generations of generations." Finally, Yəkunno ʻAmlāk is told by an angel how to prepare the oil for anointing kings, paralleling the prophet Samuel in the Bible. And the treatise concludes with the same fictitious genealogy found in the earlier hagiographies. Importantly, the text predicts that after Yəkunno ʻAmlāk, only two other kings will be anointed with the same oil, implying that one will be Johannes I. As the grandson of King Susinios, the progenitor of a new branch of the Solomonic dynasty, Johannes I and his successors undoubtedly benefited from the reinvigorated claim to legitimacy and the alleged ties with ʻAmlāk, whose successors at the influential monastery of Debre Libanos played an important role in the successes of future kings. It's difficult to exaggerate the extent to which the Glory of Kings and its foundational legend of an Israelite origin was essential to the legitimacy of the Solomonic dynasty. In a rather remarkable episode, King Johannes IV sent letters to Queen Victoria and the second Earl Granville requesting the return of a manuscript of the Glory of Kings, which was catalogued as Manuscript British Museum Oriental 819. And this manuscript had been seized during the punitive raid led by Robert Napier against the royal stronghold of Magdala in 1868. The letters stress that the loss of the manuscript, which contains the laws and regulations of the land, had caused some discord in his own country, a claim which was exaggerated by the official English translation, which instead read, quote, "My people would not obey my orders without it." That it is only this manuscript of the Glory of the Kings, along with an icon of Christ, which the Ethiopian king requested to be returned from to his country, out of the almost 500 manuscripts and other valuable objects looted by the British, shows the significance of the text for the royal dynasty. coupled with the clearly fabricated and inconsistent genealogies found in the Wealth of Kings and other texts of this period, establishing a link between the Aksumite kings of late antiquity and the dynastic founder, Yəkunno ʻAmlāk, the Solomonic dynasty succeeded in creating for itself a twofold legitimacy that not only ensured its survival for many centuries, but also became an important part of Ethiopia's historical identity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that presentation and that excursion or incursion into historical domain only unknown to me, so I'm certainly not qualified to answer any questions or to discuss the subject, but it was of course fascinating once again to see these phenomena of renovatio, of reference to semi-mythical paths, of wish to legitimate oneself through fabricated or correct genealogies, traditions, renovation claims, and so forth. So we really see this mechanism of imperial renovatio emerge very clearly, even in that domain also of history. So I guess there must certainly be questions from you.
Questions there are many. Questions there are many, but first of all, thank you very much for this intriguing presentation. I was trying to understand the main outline, especially of when really the legend of Solomonic descent was created. Initially, I understood you as if it were created in the 12th, 13th century under Yəkunno, but later I think you made it more clearly on your slides that the textual evidence goes back to Johannes, to probably the 17th century. Do I get this right? Or is there any earlier firm evidence for this tradition?
The issue is that it's really difficult to say. The manuscripts aren't preserved especially well, and the literature can be sort of inconsistent. Certainly there's claims of an Israelite descent, say from the 12th or 13th centuries. Also, in some sources, the Zagwe might have claimed to be Israelite in origin. But really it's in the 15th century under amidst that we see it really solidified in the form of the Kəbra Nagaśt in the Glory of Kings, and in this attempted coherent narrative. But it's really not referenced very much in the historical sources, which is what's sort of surprising about it. It's implicitly there, but it doesn't come up so much in the actual historiographies of later emperors.
So I think it's important to distinguish the claiming the descent from Israel maybe in the context of early Christianization of the area, whereas the dynastic claim is very specific then. And I was actually wondering all the time how much traction Christianity or say Christianity had in the area, or a recollection of the glory of Rome or the Roman Empire. I think that it was very slim in the area. And then I was wondering, you had the Caliph of Baghdad, and I'm actually not sure whether the Mamluks were still ruling in Egypt or with the successors at the time were, but you have these powerful Islamic neighbors, and then Christianization in this, say, peripheral area. And even at some point, but maybe as late as the 17th century, explicit references to the Romans, to Byzantium or whatever. So I'm wondering about the political context of these religious and then later dynastic choices.
So the thing is that for Ethiopia, they view themselves as participating in all of these traditions. So the great-grandson of amidst was Yəkunno, whose regnal name was Konstantinos, and who saw a cross made of light in the sky that ensured he was a just ruler and so forth. So they're really always drawing on all of these at the same time, and even seemingly in conflict, but for them, it's not an issue. I should also mention that the Zagwe kings are saints who are canonized in the church, and so how can you have them both be usurpers who deviated from Israel, but then also be pious saints who we can venerate? And it always seems to be conflicting, but it never actually seems to be an issue. So, thank you.
I'm sure there are other questions.
Thank you, Augustine, for your line. I will please disagreeing again. But thank you for your fascinating presentation. And my question is about the Holy Ark. The Holy Ark could be considered not like a Picus period of the Solomonic dynasties. It's my first question.
So the thing is that the Ark, even though it's part of this legend, doesn't figure in the Ethiopian sources, really. So for chronicles of wars, for example, against the neighboring Muslim states, it never comes up. And you would think it would, because you have this biblical precedent of the kings of Israel bringing out the Ark and taking it into battle and so forth. But it's not present at all. As far as I'm aware, there's really hardly any references to the Ark being in Ethiopia, despite the story of the Kəbra Nagaśt. There's maybe some later traditions, and of course, currently now there's this claimed chapel that has it, but there's no established chronology that shows, even into the Middle Ages, that this was there. On the one hand, it is part of this collective memory that they have the Ark and it legitimizes their rule, but on the other hand, it's never sort of reinforced. They don't bring it up all the time. It's not part of their constant self-identity, I would say. They sort of forget about it and then focus more on whatever seems more interesting at the time.
So in the manuscript you are translating, there are no mention of, as long as we possess the Holy Ark, the power of Solomonic will be safe, no things like that.
It's also a bit different. So in the Kəbra Nagaśt, it emphasizes that the Ark belongs in Ethiopia. So it's not that if Ethiopia has the Ark, their longevity is ensured. It's that the Ark belongs to Ethiopia. God gave it to them, and it will be there until the second coming of Christ.
No matter question. We possess that. That's all. And my second question is more challenging, because I don't know if we can make a link between the translation of the Holy Ark from Jerusalem to Ethiopia and the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem under Titus and the translation of the menorah from Jerusalem to Rome. Can we explain that, or there is a link between the two stories, or there are no link at all?
Well, no. So in the Kəbra Nagaśt, when they steal the Ark, they make a box that looks in the same dimensions, cover it with a cloth so that no one notices. And it's taken during the time of Solomon's rule. And then when they realize that it's gone, they simply, they don't tell anyone. So they say, we can't let anyone know, because then they will rise up against Israel knowing that we've lost the Ark. So this is how they explain the fact that in the biblical, related literature, there's not further discussions of the Ark. It just kind of disappears from the focus. So there's really, not this connection between the fall of the temple and the Ark, because they took it secretly.
Thank you.